Hello, everyone. I hope you're all going well today. My name's Adam, and thanks for joining. So before I kick us off, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a senior consultant with Altus. I've been with the company for about a year now. I've been working in data for almost 5 years, and my background is primarily in data visualization. Before we kick it off, I'd just like to ask that if any of you have any questions, please put these in the Q&A box, and we'll have a chance to go through these at the end of the session. All right, so without further ado, let's kick it off. So before I get started, I'd actually just like to pay my respects to the original owners of the land on which I stand today, the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people. So this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So now, what is this all about? What are we going to be talking about today? Well, how many of you have actually started a data visualization project where stakeholders have identified what they want at a high level, but they haven't thought about the details? There might be a lot of ideas and requests floating around, but no cohesive plan or structure. You might hear things like, we want a dashboard to help us understand sales across the organization. Okay, but are we looking at sales across certain products, across certain stores? Do we want to understand whether sales are growing over time, or whether they're highly seasonal? Are they attributed to a certain customer demographic? More importantly, who's going to be using this information and why? What's the end goal here? It can be a little bit overwhelming to get started. That's why I want to go through with you a recipe or framework for helping to make sense of the chaos. It's a set of steps that you can follow, questions you can ask that will set you on the right path and help you identify the right questions that your visuals will need to answer. It will guarantee that you and your organization will be confident that the product will meet all the requirements before it's built. So this is not a session where I'm going to talk about the latest Power BI features, the best visuals, tooltips, or other analysis techniques to use. This is going to be a bit more soft skills focused. As we go through the presentation, I'm going to give you example scenarios using a fictional client called Triumph Footwear. So Triumph Footwear are a retail company. They're looking to make sense of their data, and the key users for the dashboard will be execs and store managers. In a nutshell, these are the steps that we're going to be going over. I've put asterisks around the meatier topics. So phase one is all about building your context and understanding. You want to do this before organizing any big workshops or making any detailed plans. This is where you want to start to understand the overarching goals of the business. You want to understand why they want data visualization. You want to understand who the stakeholders are and where do they fit into the process. At this stage, you also want to understand what resources are available at your disposal. So you want to view any existing documentation or reports. You want to poke around in the databases and know what data you have to work with. Phase two is about discovering how we can use data. So this is the most content heavy area. This is the stage where we run workshops and interact with stakeholders the most. This is where we figure out what questions we need our dashboard to answer. We need to figure out what decisions need to be made. In this section, we'll generate the actual requirements. We'll group them by similarity and determine high-level structure of our dashboard. Our findings here are what we're going to keep returning to during the build phase in order to make sure that we're staying on track. So phase three, prototyping, I won't go into too much detail here as it's not the focus of today's session, but I will cover a few things such as tips for collaborating with stakeholders and ideating with them. I'll talk a little bit about high-level dashboard structure and picking and getting ideas for the right visualizations. We'll talk a little bit about useful wireframing tools as well. And finally, step four, I'm going to share some tips with you on getting meaningful feedback from stakeholders during and after the project. So step one, discovery. At this phase of the project, you want to set up a few one-on-one interviews with key managers or key members of each stakeholder group. This is where you want to get a feel for what they're trying to achieve. You want to understand their key business objectives and pain points. What do you want to do? What's currently going wrong? Get an understanding of their data hypothesis. What do they want to know and why? For example, we think that a spike in sales in early Jan is due to parents buying new school shoes for their children. Is it worth running promotions around this? So that could be an example of a hypothesis. Remember, the goal here is just context building. In this phase, you want to understand your stakeholder groups as well. You want to be able to identify and separate the different groups of stakeholders. You want to understand what their goals are, what pain points relate to them. You want to understand what they use their data for. What are their actual KPIs they're looking at? What are their key objectives and what actions do they typically take based on their findings? Understand how they can and how they will use the information. For example, do they want a more high-level overview, or are they going to delve into the details? This is important as it will guide how you build your dashboards and the level of grain to which you go down to. Also ask about access. Is this stakeholder group going to be restricted in what data they can access? For example, a store manager might be restricted to accessing only data from their own stores. This is going to have a pretty big impact on how you structure your dashboards. Here's an example of a profile that I've built for the store manager persona. As you can see, their key goals from a dashboard would be to track the performance of their employees and sales in their store. Actions they can take are primarily around what products they sell and promote within their own stores, as well as the rostering of staff. Their profile is going to be very different to an executive's profile who might be interested a bit more in the bigger picture. Finally, we want to assess the resources available to us. The reason you want to do this is that stakeholders will typically ask for things that they just can't have. It's really important, therefore, you go into phase 2 and the workshops, knowing exactly what data you have access to. It's also good to understand data quality here. Is that data actually going to be usable? And is the data quality likely to change in the future? Or is anything likely to change in the future? If there's an existing data visualization tool, so existing Power BI or Tableau reports, get them to demonstrate them to you. Shadow them while they pretend to go about their day-to-day. This will give you a really good understanding of how your stakeholder already uses data. So based on the questions asked during our discovery phase, here's a brief overview of Triumph Footwear's needs. Now, normally I'd go into a bit more detail than this, but given the time restraints for this section, I've kept it a little bit more brief. So you can see that their key business objectives revolve around sales, around identifying their top performing products, stores, and employees, and reporting revenue back to HQ. So their pain points at the moment, there's no clarity on sales data or factors that contribute to sales. It's difficult for the executives to report on revenue. The old system's a little bit clunky, and it's difficult for store managers to calculate commissions for staff. So what decisions are being made based on this data? So we might remove or promote top or bottom performing products or stores. We might create intervention plans or training plans for employees. And our data will influence the commission amounts that are being paid to our employees as well. So what defines success? This is really important to understand because you'll need to report on this in your visualization. Sales and lower returns. And if there's less time spent crunching numbers. Also, if there's more profit. So now we're moving on to, phase 2, defining our data stories. So we finished our initial recon, we're ready to start conducting workshops. Now it's important when you set up these workshops that you meet with all stakeholders. I've met a few managers who, for well-meaning reasons, want to speak on behalf of their teams and save them a little bit of time. But it's really important that you speak to the people on the ground also. Remember, these are the people who are actually going to be using your product. Once you've set up the meetings, you want to send out the agenda ASAP. The reason being is that you want to encourage the workshop attendees to read through that agenda and really think about what you're going to be going through before the workshops. You'll then use this agenda to help guide the session. Usually stakeholders will have already thought a little bit about their problems and about how they can use data. You just want to use this as a springboard. And often there'll be one person who's frustrated enough to actually look through the meeting agenda before the meeting happens. If someone does look through the agenda beforehand, and if they reach out to you before the session, you can assume that they're invested in making the dashboard work. And it's a good idea to use this person as an ideas springboard throughout the entire design, build, and test process. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in later slides. If you're running a workshop online, it's a good idea to build a whiteboard using tools such as Mural or FigJam and put all of your pre-work and assumptions there. And that way your stakeholders will have the chance to go through and look at that. So now what to ask in your workshops? There's a lot of different ways to do this, but I like to structure the beginning of my workshops around problems and understanding problem statements. You should have defined these problem statements in phase one, but we can use the workshop as an opportunity to revisit them in a group setting, discuss them further, and add new ones if necessary. If you want, you can rank them in terms of complexity and severity. This will help you determine prioritizations later. High priority pain points that are more complex are probably going to demand a lot more of your attention. In some circumstances, you can also rephrase these problem statements as questions instead. This is something I typically do later on in the process, but I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this. So once you've really nailed out your pain points and key questions, then we can start talking about solutions, feature requests, data that your client might want to see in order to resolve those problems. You want to ask these questions in the context of each problem statement. So when we want to solve problem X, what is important to look at in a glance? What KPIs do you want to see? You want to talk a little bit about facts and dimensions here, so ways of slicing and dicing the data. For example, if we're looking at total revenue from sales, that would be our KPI and our fact. Dimensions might be, do we want to slice up those sales by product, by store, et cetera, et cetera. You want to talk a little bit about the grain here as well. So if we're looking at sales, we're looking at sales per day, per hour, per month. Next, we want to understand why. Why do we need this data? How does it solve your problem? What actions are going to result from it? For example, if I can see that sales are dipping at the same time every day, what am I going to do about it? Will I change how I roster my staff? Do I run some kind of promotion? Do I give out free food around lunchtime to get people in the door? And how will I know that my action worked? We need to think about that too. So when are we going to be using this info? When in the process are we going to be using this information? So when I talk about the process, I'm talking about the entire business process. Are we going to be looking at this data retrospectively? Or are we going to be looking at it proactively? So when I say retrospective, I'm saying, are we trying to understand something that happened in the past? How did sales go last month or last quarter? Or are we being proactive and trying to understand what's happening in real time or even in the future? Finally, we want to relate this back to a specific user. Who's going to be using this? It's a good idea to always try and frame these feature requests and data insights as a story. So I've put in an example story down the bottom, and it resembles a classic user story statement. As a store manager, I need to see sales across different products at the end of each day, week, and month, so that I can identify low and high performing products and order more or less or change my windows displays accordingly. We've been really clear here about who needs to see what and what actions they're going to take as a result of that. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about frameworks for capturing this feedback. So often I will find myself running these workshops on tools such as Mural or FigJam. If you're running them in person, then you'll usually have some kind of whiteboard and you'll be writing notes or dropping sticky notes on the whiteboard. Mural and FigJam are particularly great because you can prepare these frameworks beforehand. Stakeholders can just dump their own stickies wherever they feel they belong. If they're really keen, they can even go into that whiteboard before the session and start dumping stickies for you to find when you start going through. This is a really good way to get the more shy people to participate as well, because no one actually needs to speak. You can just drop a sticky note on the board. There are lots of different frameworks for capturing these stickies, but it really depends on the nature of the project and what you're trying to achieve. Often the left is what I'm trying to get to at the end of the session. So you can see on the left, I've got key problem statements or key questions in the middle in yellow, and then any data or feature requests or thoughts that relate to that problem statement just sit around it in orange. So it creates a kind of mind map structure. This is the ideal state. It can be a little bit hard to get straight there, particularly if you don't understand what your key problem statements are going into the session. So if in doubt, then the template that I've got on the right, you can't really go wrong with. It's just a way for your stakeholders to classify their requests in terms of must-haves, should-haves, and nice-to-haves. If you are running a session online, it's a really good idea to encourage everybody to log in and leave a test sticky note before the workshop. You don't want technical issues to get in the way. If you're interested in learning about different types of templates you can use for capturing this feedback, then there are many resources out there, such as Luma, Workplace, or Mural. So next, once you've captured all of these feature requests and all of these requirements, you need to start grouping them together logically. What you'll usually end up with at the end of a session is a massive brain dump of all the feature requests, requirements, questions, facts, dimensions, and random thoughts that the clients throw at you. It might look something a little bit like this. The next step is to go through and organize everything you see and see what useful information you can pull out of it. Remember, the ultimate goal from this is to achieve tangible visualization requirements. What do we need to visualize and how? Finally, not everything needs to be translated as a separate requirement. Usually you'll get a lot of sticky notes that kind of relate to the same thing, and you can just combine them into one. If you do this, just make sure you capture all the more detailed stuff that goes into the stickies, just so that nothing gets missed. So once we start grouping things together based on similarity, we can start to identify key themes and key categories. You can see from this slide here, the key themes I've identified for Triumph Footwear are reporting revenue to HQ. So all the stickies in this circle all relate to that problem. Understanding factors that drive sales is another one of our key requirements. Judging employee effectiveness. And finally, security and access. Now, it's very common that at the end of these sessions, you'll end up with a kind of miscellaneous category or non-functional requirements category that relate to things like security and access, etc. Once you've identified these high-level requirements, the next thing you want to do is put them into some sort of format that can be shared with the organization. Usually that's some sort of requirements matrix or Excel document. And then you can start creating subcategories off of the back of that. So categories you don't need to follow the same method that I've used for categorizing your requirements. You can do this in a lot of different ways. Some other ways might include grouping based on key entities, so products, stores, etc. Grouping requirements based on whether they're proactive or retrospective, like we talked about before. Key tasks, or as I've done, key questions. Now that we've got the requirements documented, we get them signed off by the stakeholders, and then we can use them to generate ideas for visualizations. We can refer back to them at later stages and use them as a kind of checklist to make sure that we've met all of our requirements. i.e., one requirement that falls out of this might be show items sold and dollars made per salesman per hour. This is a really clear-cut check that we can run against our dashboard, and we can even start generating visual ideas to meet these requirements. Now, it can be difficult sometimes to figure out what these categories are. If you're really struggling with this, then it can be a good idea to ask clients in the workshop to categorize their requirements themselves. Often they'll have an idea of where their problems sit. For example, you might have a client say, our problems generally fit into two camps: not understanding products and stores that are generating the most revenue, and not understanding how efficient our employees are at selling, and whether there are certain products or sales tactics that could be upskilled. So asking this question is a really good way to break the ice with your stakeholders and get the conversation flowing in the right direction. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about creating user stories. So user stories, they're often not mandatory, but they are fantastic ways to reframe your requirements. They allow you to look through problems through the lens of the user, and they're perfect for testing the dashboard in the later stages. The reason I love user stories so much is that it helps you get out of your own head and think like the user. This is useful because as a developer, you've spent hour upon hour working on these dashboards, you know it back to front, and you have a very unique view and understanding that your regular user may not share. Remember that the purpose of your dashboard is to tell a story. A story will always have a user, a need, and an action. It's often helpful as well to think about your dashboard in terms of an exception, drill down, and action method. So when a user comes in, they should be able to quickly identify an exception or anomaly. They should be able to drill down and identify the root cause of that problem and take an action in response. It's a good idea to work closely with stakeholders to develop these stories. They are meant to describe things from their perspective after all. If you've got someone who's a real keen bean, then you can even get them to write it for you. I usually like to have at least a few high-level user stories to use as test criteria as I'm building out the dashboard. It just really helps to make sure that no integral capabilities are missed. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about prototyping. So in this section, I'm going to talk about high-level structure. When I say high-level structure, I mean what dashboards and how many dashboards are going to be needed, what requirements are going to be met on which dashboard, and who has access to what. I'm going to talk a little bit about generating ideas for visuals. So what's the best visual to meet each requirement and how do we get to that conclusion? I'll talk a little bit about wireframing tools and tips for getting constant feedback. So high-level structure. How you structure your dashboard is based on the feedback that you get in step 2. So again, when I talk about high-level structure, I'm talking about how many dashboards are we needed, what's the purpose for each dashboard, and who's going to have access and who's going to use each of those. Usually stakeholders will already have a good idea of this. Most of the projects I've been on, I'm often actually just told what the high-level structure is expected to be going in. However, even if you are told what the structure is expected to be, it's still a good idea to challenge those conceptions and to understand why the client wants things to be done that way. Remember, there are many, many ways to structure your dashboards. The method that you choose needs to suit the questions the stakeholders need answers to. The way I like to think about it is that similar questions or similar problems need to be resolved on the same dashboard. Once you've come up with a high-level structure, it's a good idea to share this early on and see what your stakeholders think. If you've done a good job of grouping your requirements in stage 2 by similarity, high-level structure will usually just fall out as a result of that. And always, always, always link these back to your data stories. What questions does each of the dashboards answer? This is where your user stories are going to come in handy. For me personally, when I'm doing this, I always think about what questions each dashboard answers. I'll literally write those questions out, and then I'll think about visualizations that provide answers to those questions. Then I'll go back and double check that all of the visuals that I've listed out for that dashboard meet the requirements that we identified earlier. So here's an example of a high-level structure that I've created for Triumph Footwear. So I've kept it a little bit brief. The first 2 dashboards I'll talk about, I'm focusing on 2 of the key entities, so products and stores. You could go crazy here and keep adding more. We could have another dashboard specifically for customers, another one for returns. I've kept it brief just for the sake of keeping this session within the time limit. We've also got 2 separate dashboards that serve specific functions. So one that reports on high-level revenue and sales overviews across the organization, and another one for employee tracking that would be used for calculating commissions. On a high level, these dashboards can be split into 2 categories based on the level of access that's required. So that top row is looking across the entire organization, whereas the bottom row is specific to a certain store. So these access requirements are just to prevent store managers from tracking the performance of other stores and their employees. Because the executives require revenue tracking and high-level sales data across the entire organization, we're going to create a specific dashboard just for them. So this dashboard, which is the one on the top left, would answer questions like, what are our top performing stores? What's our revenue for the year? It looks at the entire organization holistically. The products dashboard, on the other hand, so the top right, this one analyzes product sales across the entire org. It helps executives and store managers understand what the top performing products are. For a store manager, it might answer questions like, what product should I be ordering more of? For executives, it might answer questions like, which low performing products are we going to pull from the shelves next year? Since the data is aggregated across the organization, we will allow access to both stakeholder groups here. So store performance, bottom left, that is what store managers can use to track how their store performs against the organization's benchmark. They can use it to identify their own best-selling products and how this compares to the rest of the organization. And finally, with the bottom right, store managers are required to calculate commissions for their staff as well. So we created a separate dashboard just for this. It answers questions like, who are my best performing employees and how can other certain employees improve? Due to sensitivity, we will make this one of our more restricted dashboards. So once we've got a good idea of the requirements from phase 2 and we've identified our high level structure, we can start using this to generate ideas for visuals. So earlier in the last slide, you would have seen I rephrased some of the requirements as questions that are being answered for by each dashboard. You'll recall that similar questions are answered on the same dashboards. Now we need to actually write these questions out and think about ways we can answer them using data. How can we explore these questions further? How can we test out new hypotheses? This is where you want to list out visual ideas and think about useful ways to slice and dice the data. So I've done an example table here for the executive dashboard. So you can see here, I've taken the first question, what are our top performing stores? And I've come up with some other hypotheses we might want to test. So what are our worst performers? How does performance differ by region? Are some stores better at selling certain products? I've written down an idea on how to answer these questions using a bar chart. So this is just one example. There are obviously many different ways to do this. And I've also included some ideas on how we can slice and dice the information in that bar chart that would allow us to explore our other hypotheses as well. To make sure that they actually have the data to support these visualizations before you start sharing this around with stakeholders. Once you've clarified that you can actually provide this visualization, then you're ready to start sharing that and getting feedback. Once you've got feedback, you're ready to move on to the wireframing. So a little bit about wireframing. So wireframing, my preference is usually to draw out a rough wireframe by hand in a notebook and build the dashboard itself in a more agile method, collaborating closely with stakeholders along the way. However, sometimes that isn't practical. Clients will usually want to see some kind of wireframe before they commit to the work. This is especially true for waterfall projects. It's also usually true if the underlying data models haven't been built already. So when you need to start building a wireframe, Figma is often a really great tool. Once you've finished drawing rough sketches of your wireframe in your notebook, build it out in Figma. Figma is very easy to learn. There's a lot of free training courses, and it's a bit more interactive and professional looking than PowerPoint. If you don't like that particular tool, there are others out there. Next thing you want to do is keep sharing this with your stakeholders. It's really important to get constant feedback throughout the process. Usually your organization will put you into a team or they'll assign someone to help you out, but it's also a good idea to find a champion earlier on in the project. So this could be someone who is particularly engaged during your stakeholder interviews, someone who has a lot of ideas. This is somebody that you might want to collaborate with and pitch ideas to. If you find that one person in your workshops is offering 80% of the ideas or they're reaching out to you spontaneously, organize lots of one-on-one sessions with them. Pitch your wireframe, pitch your ideas, and get their feedback. This will really help to accelerate the design process. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about getting meaningful feedback from all of your stakeholders. Now, I do stress the word meaningful here. We're not looking for tips on what colors or what fonts to use. It's a good idea to constantly engage a small number of stakeholders from each group throughout the process. You don't want the horror scenario of presenting the last 2 months of your work and have someone say, this is not what we wanted. When you do feel that you're ready for that big feedback session, it's a good idea to make it a UAT style session rather than a show and tell. By show and tell, I mean, don't say, this is the executive dashboard. This is the visual used to track revenue. These visuals rank store performance, etc. Don't do this. It's boring. It lacks context. No one is going to be paying attention. You don't want to tell them how they should be using the dashboard. You want to show them using examples. The way I like to do this is have 2 or 3 basic tasks and get one of the stakeholders in your group to log in front of everyone and complete these tasks using your dashboard. Obviously, you want to discuss this with that stakeholder beforehand and get them to do a practice run. If the stakeholder is struggling to complete some of the tasks, then your dashboard probably needs some more work. Watching someone with little prior knowledge is very informative for testing UIs. They're going to be the ones who find all the little bugs and all the parts of the dashboard that aren't as intuitive as you thought. Remember that as a developer, you've spent hour upon hour working on this thing. You know it inside out. You're not qualified to conduct UAT. So a pro tip for you as well, have a look through the data and direct them towards little Easter eggs you want them to find. This gets your stakeholders really excited. For example, once I built a fraud detection dashboard for a client, I noticed that when I went through the data that certain age groups of customers were more prone to identity theft than others. So in my UAT session, I asked my client to identify if certain age groups are more likely to be victims of fraud. They went in, they found the anomaly themselves, and this got them really excited because it demonstrated the dashboard's potential. If you're using dummy data, then you can even plant these anomalies in there yourself. It goes without saying, but do test these data discovery tests before you run your sessions, and preferably with a colleague as well. At the conclusion of UAT, then you can ask for more generic feedback and then adjust your design accordingly. Generic feedback I've included down the bottom there. It's also a good idea to record the session and monitor what your user did. Where was their attention drawn? What did they try when they were probing the dashboard? If they didn't intuitively reach for the correct visual or behave as you expected, maybe you need to readjust your design. Now, as a final step, I've just included some resources that you might find helpful. I did talk about each of these throughout the presentation. So Figma, this one at the top, really good wireframing tool. It's great for any kind of UI design project. It's a bit more interactive than PowerPoint. You can create links between different objects on your different wireframe pages. So if I click on a button, it'll navigate me to the page that corresponds to that button. It's not linear like with PowerPoint. This makes it really good for demonstrating drill downs as well. You can even include things like tooltips. Luma Workplace, so this is really good for generating content for workshops. It contains a list of recipes and design principles that you can apply. It's similar to the content that we've discussed in the session, but it's less detailed and a little bit less focused on data visualization. And then finally, Mural. So Mural and FigJam as well as another one are really good tools for online collaboration. They're really good for running workshops. Everyone can go in, they can leave stickies, you can create templates so you can capture feedback in a specific format. It encourages even the most shy people to participate, but do just make sure that everyone can log in and access it before you run your project, before you run your workshop. All right, well, thanks for that, everybody. Now I'm going to open up the Q&A box and we'll start going through some of these questions. So I've got a question here regarding visualization ideas. Do you have any guidance for how to decide appropriate visualization types for different requirements? This is a complex topic. There's a lot of controversy, I guess, around picking the right visualization. Some people feel pretty strongly about certain ones or others. So I won't go into too much detail. There's plenty of online resources here, but you will find that certain visualization types are more geared for certain types of analysis. For example, if you're looking at data that's continuous, like continuous time data, things like line charts might be good. If you're looking to sort of rank different categories against each other, things like bar charts can often be quite useful. If you're looking to identify anomalies or exceptions or outliers in your data, things like scatter charts can be really good. But the recipe that you use to get to these really comes off at the back of what your questions are. So you need to iron out your questions first and really understand what you're trying to answer with the data before you can land on an actual visualization type. All right, well, that was the only question. So thank you everyone for joining today. I hope you got a lot out of this session and we hope to see you again in the future.